Right now, as you watch this, something is rising from the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Not a ghost, not a myth, not a Hollywood reconstruction. It is oil. Real, physical oil from a battleship that sank on December 7th, 1941, over 80 years ago, and it is still escaping into the water today. Drop by drop, every single day, a ship that has been dead longer than most living human beings have been alive is still bleeding into the harbor around it. Scientists call it a slow seep, but what it really is one of the most extraordinary puzzles in ocean science. This may be one of the slowest environmental release events ever recorded in maritime history. Not a spill, not a disaster. A leak so controlled, so gradual, so impossibly patient that the ocean itself has been quietly managing it for 8 decades without catastrophic consequence. By every reasonable calculation, this should not be happening. The fuel should have burned. It should have degraded. It should have been consumed by bacteria, dissolved by chemistry, absorbed by the sea. And yet, the USS Arizona refuses to stop, which forces us to ask the real question, not just why Arizona is still leaking, but what this wreck is actually teaching us about the deep, slow, hidden timelines of the ocean itself. On the morning of the attack, USS Arizona was carrying approximately 1.5 million gallons of bunker C fuel oil, the heavy viscous petroleum that powered Pacific Fleet operations across the theater. It was one of the most fuel-loaded vessels at Pearl Harbor that day. Within minutes of a Japanese armor-piercing bomb penetrating the forward deck and igniting the ammunition magazine below, the resulting explosion was so catastrophic equivalent in energy to a small tactical nuclear detonation by some engineering estimates that the ship sank in roughly 9 minutes. 9 minutes. From fully operational warship to wreck resting on the harbor floor, with 1,177 men still aboard. Much of the fuel burned in the initial inferno visible for miles across Oahu. Significant quantities escaped during the violent flooding. But a battleship of Arizona's class was not built with simple fuel tanks sitting exposed inside an open hull. It was engineered for sustained combat survival. Its fuel was distributed across dozens of compartmentalized, armored tanks integrated deep into the ship's structural skeleton, a design philosophy specifically intended to absorb torpedo hits and battle damage without triggering total fuel loss. When the ship sank so rapidly, many of those tanks sealed themselves by sheer accident. Collapse, debris displacement, and sudden pressure equalization across the sinking hull created closed chemical chambers. The sea could flood around, but not through. And inside those sealed spaces, 80 years began to pass. Here is what most people do not understand about underwater decay. It is not uniform, and it is not fast. In open water with full oxygen circulation, steel corrodes aggressively. Marine organisms colonize exposed surfaces. Structural failure cascades through weakened frames within decades. But inside sealed or semi-sealed compartments, the chemistry transforms entirely. Oxygen is consumed quickly by initial microbial activity and early chemical reactions. Once depleted, the primary driver of corrosion, the electrochemical oxidation of iron, slows to a fraction of its normal rate. Marine engineers call these low-energy corrosion environments. In practical terms, it means that sealed sections of USS Arizona have been degrading at rates more comparable to deep ocean wrecks than to shallow harbor structures exposed to tidal circulation. Consider this: the Titanic, resting at 12,500 feet of depth in the North Atlantic, is in some measurable respects degrading faster than certain sections of Arizona sitting in 40 feet of Hawaiian harbor water. That is not poetry, that is documented chemistry. Depth alone does not determine how fast a wreck decays. Oxygen availability, temperature gradients, sediment coverage, and compartment geometry interact to produce outcomes that defy every simple expectation. Arizona's sealed fuel compartments found conditions where time, quite literally, slowed down. The ship was not preserved by human intention or institutional care. It was preserved by accident, by the speed of its own destruction. But the type of fuel matters just as much as the architecture that contains it. Bunker C fuel oil is not like gasoline. It is not like diesel. It is not like any fuel most people have direct experience with. It is the heaviest, commercially refined petroleum product in regular industrial use, thick, dark, almost geological in its density, loaded with complex hydrocarbon chains, asphalt compounds, sulfur residues, and high molecular weight fractions that resist both evaporation and microbial degradation with exceptional tenacity. At room temperature, it barely pours. In cooler harbor water, it moves so slowly it behaves less like a liquid and more like a slow-motion solid deforming against the steel walls surrounding it over months and years. USS Arizona may carry one of the longest-running contained oil reserves in recorded naval history, fuel loaded in 1941 that has never reached its intended destination, never powered a single mile of Pacific transit, and is still technically in transit now, moving through corroded steel at geological pace. When this fuel is trapped inside damaged tanks at the bottom of a harbor, it does not drain. It does not seek available openings the way water does. It waits. It thickens. And only when corrosion eventually opens a pathway, a fractured weld seam, a millimeter-scale gap in degraded hull plating, a pinhole opened by decades of microbial pitting, does a small quantity begin migrating outward, finding its way through the interior of a ship that is slowly, silently, opening itself, one molecule at a time, to the sea around it. Current scientific modeling estimates that between 100,000 and 500,000 gallons of oil may still remain sealed inside the wreck. The width of that uncertainty range is itself a data point because Arizona is simultaneously a protected war memorial, an active legal gravesite for sailors whose remains were never recovered, and a fragile structure that cannot be probed without risk of accelerating the very collapse researchers are trying to prevent. Scientists cannot drill sensor ports through the hull. They cannot insert measurement probes into sealed compartments. Instead, they work with surface seep rate monitoring, acoustic structural mapping, sediment core sampling around the wreck perimeter, and computational fluid dynamics, modeling, building a picture of what remains inside a ship they are not permitted to fully enter. This leak has persisted longer than most naval careers. It has outlasted every officer who commanded Arizona. It has outlasted most of the engineers who designed her. It has continued through 12 U.S. presidents, through the entire Cold War, through the rise of the internet, through the careers of every scientist currently studying it. Observed daily seep rates vary between a few ounces and several quarts depending on tidal pressure cycles, seasonal water temperature shifts, and ongoing structural micro-movement in the hull. What is remarkable is that despite 80 continuous years of release, Pearl Harbor has not experienced the catastrophic environmental collapse early researchers feared. The harbor has not died. It has not been coated in petroleum film, which means something biological, something the ocean built entirely on its own, has been managing this entire time. The ocean is not a passive container. It is one of the most biologically active and chemically responsive environments on Earth, and it treats contamination not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be processed. Within hours of oil reaching the water column, hydrocarbon-degrading bacteria begin colonizing the rising droplets. These are not rare or exotic organisms. They exist at background levels throughout marine environments worldwide, reproductively primed for exactly this kind of petroleum energy source. Bacterial genera, including Alcanovirax, Marinobacter, and Oleospira, metabolize petroleum compounds as primary nutrition, enzymatically breaking complex molecular chains into simpler compounds accessible to broader microbial communities. In Pearl Harbor's warm subtropical waters, this biological processing runs measurably faster than in cold, deep ocean environments, faster metabolism, higher reproductive rates, more efficient molecular breakdown per unit of time. When Arizona's oil reaches the surface, ultraviolet radiation from sunlight drives additional photochemical degradation, cleaving hydrocarbon bonds that microbes alone cannot efficiently target. The result is a processing loop that has been running continuously for 8 decades, without institutional management, without engineering intervention, without human design of any kind. Oil rises. Bacteria colonize it in the water column. Surface photochemistry breaks it further. Dispersion scatters what remains across the harbor basin. The harbor functions as a living biological filter, not eliminating the release, but transforming it continuously, preventing the accumulation that would produce visible environmental catastrophe. This is not a system anyone designed. It is ecology doing precisely what ecology evolved to do across billions of years. Absorb what enters, break it apart, and rebuild something living from the pieces. But here is where the science becomes genuinely uncomfortable for everyone involved. Structural aging in shipwrecks does not follow smooth, predictable degradation curves that engineers can model with confidence. It follows what researchers call punctuated degradation, extended periods of apparent stability interrupted by sudden, localized structural failures, as corrosion thresholds are silently crossed in specific zones. A weld joint that has held load for 60 years may fail completely within a single season once corrosion reduces its cross-section below a critical threshold. A bulkhead, thinned by decades of microbial pitting, may collapse without measurable warning. Internal load transfer frames that have redistributed structural forces across multiple hull members lose capacity gradually and then catastrophically, in the way that engineered materials fail when overstressed past their margin. Some researchers believe Arizona is approaching a period of accelerated internal structural change. If sealed fuel compartments collapse or breach in rapid sequence, the release profile could shift dramatically, temporarily exceeding the harbor's biological processing capacity and triggering a genuine, visible environmental event with regulatory and ecological consequences. Others argue that sediment accumulation beneath and around the hull over 80 years has provided passive structural support that is actually slowing, not accelerating, the timeline to significant failure. There is no scientific consensus, which means preservation engineers face one of the most ethically and technically complex decisions in the history of maritime science. Attempt controlled extraction of remaining fuel through carefully engineered intervention, accepting the risk of destabilizing a structure that holds both petroleum and human remains, or accept the risk of uncontrolled release and trust the harbor's biological systems to continue managing it as they have for 8 decades. There is no safe path. There is only managed uncertainty, extended across a timeline measured in generations. What Arizona has quietly become beyond memorial, beyond museum exhibit, beyond the reach of any single historical narrative, is one of the most valuable, long-term material science datasets ever accidentally generated by a human event. Corrosion models used by engineers designing modern offshore oil platforms were refined in part through long-term wreck observation programs, including data collected at Pearl Harbor. Naval architects designing damage survivability systems for current surface combatants study how Arizona's compartmentalization architecture performed and failed across 8 decades of real-world marine exposure. Subsea pipeline engineers and offshore infrastructure designers use degradation rate data derived from monitoring programs anchored to World War II wreck sites. The ship launched in 1915 to project American naval power across the Pacific is now in 2024, providing structural intelligence to engineers designing the infrastructure of the 21st century ocean economy. This is not a footnote to Arizona's legacy. It is an active continuation of it. The ship is still producing output, not as a warship, but as an accidental long-duration laboratory running controlled experiments that no funding body would ever have approved for 80 consecutive years. generating data that no deliberately designed study program could have replicated. Time, pressure, biology, temperature gradient, and material chemistry are all still active variables. And scientists are still reading the results, still updating their models, still being surprised by what the wreck reveals about how engineered materials behave when the ocean has decades to work on them. There is a concept in marine science called material transformation succession, the process by which human structures entering the ocean are gradually, irreversibly incorporated into biological systems, their physical substance redistributed into the living chemistry of the sea around them. It is not decay in the way most people imagine decay. It is conversion. It is the ocean rewriting human engineering in the language of biology. Arizona is deep into that process and accelerating. Its steel is converting into iron oxide minerals that settle into the sediment record, becoming part of the geological layer that future scientists may one day core and analyze. Its trapped fuel is becoming microbial biomass and dissolved organic carbon entering the harbor food chain at the base of the trophic pyramid. Its exterior surfaces host encrusting organisms, corals, tube worms, sponges, bryozoans, and dozens of fish species that now treat the hull as permanent structural habitat. The 1,177 men who never left the ship rest within a structure that has become inseparable from the living ecosystem surrounding them. The ocean does not erase history, it rewrites it in biology. And Arizona is one of the most detailed examples of that rewriting currently accessible to science. 80 years of conversion, still actively underway, in 40 feet of water that anyone with a boat and a research permit can reach. So why is USS Arizona still leaking oil after more than 80 years? Because the ocean operates on timescales that human intuition was never built to process. Because bunker C fuel resists degradation in ways that lighter petroleum products do not, carrying molecular complexity that takes not years but centuries to fully break down. Because compartmentalized steel, sealed by the speed of its own catastrophic sinking, created chemical conditions more similar to the deep ocean than to the shallow harbor surrounding the hull. Because hydrocarbon metabolizing microbes evolved across geological time to consume exactly what escapes through those corroded seams. And because the ocean patient, biological, ancient, beyond any human reference point, has been quietly processing the release the entire time, converting what leaks into something the ecosystem can absorb, rebuild, and incorporate into its own ongoing chemistry. Those drops of oil rising through the water column every day are not simply remnants of a single morning in 1941. They are evidence of how long human structures remain active once they enter the ocean's timeline. They are evidence that what we call endings are, in ocean terms, transitions, from warship to reef, from fuel reserve to carbon cycle, from historical artifact to living ecosystem component. Arizona is not finished. It is changing on a schedule the ocean set, using processes the ocean owns, toward an outcome the ocean has been executing since before the first human hand ever touched the steel that built her. The ocean does not erase history, it rewrites it in biology, and it will be rewriting Arizona long after every human institution currently monitoring her has itself become part of the sediment record. If this is how you want to understand the ocean, not as a backdrop to human history, but as the environment that outlasts and ultimately absorbs everything human history produces, subscribe to Sunken Realms Deep. Every wreck we cover is still running its own experiment. The ocean is still reading the results, and the data it is collecting is nothing like what anyone expected.